right. Well, hello everybody. Welcome again to another Friends, Food, and Faith. So we have one friend. That's good news, right? So it's good. There was some food. So we'll talk a little about the faith. So I thought it was probably good, especially during this June, which usually is kind of celebrated as Pride Month, to kind of talk about the pelvic issues of the church, so to speak, right? So I think oftentimes the church gets criticized a lot about the pelvic issues, meaning like sexuality. Um, Maybe rightly so, but I think that's also where kind of our generation, our culture is directed to. I mean, I think even personally, you see that in art and movies and commercials, how sexualized things become over time. Even kind of this kind of uprise in some ways, especially now in this generation with like transgenderism. And that even started maybe a rise with homosexuality. Now, many critics may say that actually, it's just society is more open to it, so people can come out a little bit easier, even though that's probably always been there. Well, that may be true, but I think it's also important to talk about what the church teaches when it comes to people who experience what we call same-sex attraction, or even heterosexual people, what their call is, and even those that maybe experience gender dysphoria, right? And understand what the church teaches about these things. So obviously, a lot of the teaching is based in Scripture, right? So we're told very early on that to lay with someone of the same sex would be a grave sin, to the point even in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, Leviticus, um, it meant death, right? That was a violation of the sixth commandment. But I think it's also important to recognize too that that wasn't the only thing that required death, the violation of the sixth commandment. Adultery would require death if one violated the sixth commandment. There's actually, even going back further, a something called onanism. So I don't know if anyone knows onanism, but onanism is named after one of the sons of Judah. So this goes even back to Genesis. That there was this woman that was promised to one of the sons of Judah. That son, we're told, on the night of their wedding, spilled his seed, meaning he did not complete the marital act, and because of that, he died. And then there was another son that then, because the law was that now we have to get married to the next son, and he did the same thing, he died. So Judah had to marry her and completed the act. So that's where you get the understanding of masturbation, right? So this all flows from the sixth commandment that any action outside the bond of marriage would be a violation of the sixth commandment, whether by yourself or another person, right? So it's always good to understand the basis of that, understand the purpose of it. And then we might ask that question of like, well, why? Why is that so important that we actually maintain that bond? Or why is it so important that if we're two willing adults and we want to engage in this way, what's the big deal about receiving that from each other, right? Even outside the bond of marriage. Well, I think that the answer to that even goes back earlier to the very beginning and also the very end of the scripture, right? So it's interesting that we start Genesis with a marriage, right? Maybe not a sacramental marriage, as we understand, as instituted by Jesus, but a marriage nonetheless, that these two beings were created out of nothing, or maybe, at least initially out of nothing into something. And they were meant to be there for each other, be a gift to each other. And that's kind of recognized actually really early on. We read in Genesis how before Eve was created, Adam was presented with all the creation and said, look, you got dominion, and so you're going to get to name everything here. That's very significant because giving a name to something or someone actually shows responsibility for it. There's an identity given, and because of that identity, there's a relationship. And so in that respect, the fact that Adam was given this task, this relationship with all creation, it was not only showing his dominance and dominion over all creation, but also showing for him personally that he was alone. And we call that original solitude. So Adam, by naming all these animals, recognizing that's not like me, grew in his development of understanding, oh, wait a minute, I need someone else like me too. And it's in that understanding that God then creates Eve from his rib, right? And because of that, they're one flesh from the same side, right? And so they're married. There's a marriage bond from the very beginning that God established in natural ways. Now, it's interesting though that we don't hear about any children being created before the fall, right? So before the fall, everything's in harmony, and Adam and Eve are treating each other with respect and dignity towards who they are through their own bodies, any male and female body. And so in other words, they weren't looking upon each other with an act of lust. It was looking on each other with an act of love, seeing the good of the other, the end that is there that terminates finally in God, in this divine action. So the fall happens, then all of a sudden we start having children. So one may argue, well, then is sex wrong because it happened after the fall? Well, no, right? The church would teach that sex definitely is not bad. It's meant for a good. And we know that by what we consider what we call the ends or the goods of marriage, or the ends of the goods in sex, right? So when we talk about marriage, there are always sacraments have effects and graces and goods, right? And so marriage is the goods are actually threefold, right? So especially in a sacramental marriage, we would say that there's a bond that is directed by God that unifies a couple. So in other words, God is put forefront and first in these people's lives, meant to guide them and direct them. And from that relationship with God by these two people, that unifies these two people in a bond of love. And that's a unification. That's a bond that cannot be dissolved, right? It cannot be destroyed. The only thing that can really do that would be God, right? And then from that bond of love, just like the Trinity is overflowing in love and creative, a bond of love between two people that are meant for that bond would also create new people. And we call that procreation, right? So sacramentality is the highest good. Unification is the good that flows from that. And then procreation flows from that. Now notice there's a hierarchy there too, right? And it's not procreation is the highest one. Because people tend to think, when I work with couples and talk the theology of marriage, I think it's important to point that out. Because even though we love babies, we want babies, no one's saying we don't, that's not the highest good. Because if the relationship with God is not correct, the unification won't be good. And if the unification won't be good, bringing new children, new people involved in it won't help anything, right? So there is something about when a man and a woman get married, their direction is actually towards that other. And I do everything I can now for this person. Now, children will come from that, and I have responsibility to them too, but my first order priority is to my spouse. And that may sound kind of odd, especially even those of us who are married and have children, because we may think, well, now my direction should be to our children. Well, the church will say, well, no, your highest priority actually is to God, then your spouse, then to your children. And so, because the other thing too is eventually we get old. And so our children would end up leaving us. God is always going to be present there, and this other person is still going to be present there, right? So if I'm not directing my life towards this other, when my children leave, well, what do we have left now, right? So there's a wisdom involved with that in many ways, right? So I think that's also a misconception needs to be overcome, that when we talk about the marriage, that's directed, coming from God, directed towards this other person. And everything in my life is directed towards giving that person to their highest good. And what's that highest good? Well, life with God, right? So I want to make that very clear. And in that respect, that kind of maybe clears up a lot of things about what we understand when it comes to relationships, bonds outside of that bond, right? So the question that was raised was, why do we really care about if someone's in a bond or not? Well, not only is this an act of love towards the other, that I am dedicating publicly, that I am dedicating my life, giving this other person rights to my own body, right? Which is what the bond of marriage does. It also, the effects of that, procreation, also the children that are involved and growing into that and born into that relationship also have rights. They have rights to be born in a committed, loving relationship, right? Because otherwise, well, what happens there, right? that, okay, I brought this child in this world. Okay, fine. Um, does that child now, is that the rearing and the development of that child now affected because you're not in a bond of marriage? And or how does the development of the child affected when maybe there is a breakup or divorce or anything else like that, right? I think we're really early in like looking at these things because, well, you know, growing up maybe in the mid 20th century, divorce wasn't really done all that often, and there was movements in society to kind of allow it to be easier to do those things. And even now, we're seeing studies from children who were raised in two-parent households compared to children that weren't raised in two-parent households, and it's not a good effect, right? I mean, it's almost like night and day between the effects from those who are raised in a two-parent household and those not. Now, that's not to say that people who grow up in a one-parent household, it's hopeless, obviously, right? I mean, no one wants to be called statistic, but also it's better to have a male and a female presence. I think that not only stats, but also logic and reason in our own depths of our heart tell us that it actually is better. Now, sometimes can't help circumstance. Maybe a spouse dies. Maybe there's other factors that come into play. We don't want to, you know, reduce people in those respects. But I think we all say the ideal would be that you live in a two-parent household. And when we talk about two-parent, we're talking about a mother and a father. I think the other thing that we tend to look at or miss is that we just don't really have a lot of data of what it's like for children to be raised by same-sex parents. You know, that's sort of a trend that started without any really backup from a data analysis or statistical analysis, but even from a psychological or even a sociological aspect. I think there's been such a movement of like, you know, well, you know, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, that may be true, but even within a village, you still have a direct parents that are responsible for the individual, right? Especially in their development and growth. So what we see in the world, this kind of shift towards, well, you know, a parent is a parent, whether they're same-sex or you know, they're heterosexual. Well, I don't know if we can really say that's true. And time will tell, I suppose, whether that is going to be good or not for society. But I think also, too, it's wise to say in the presence of no data to go with what is known. And I think the church would also say that, too. That's not to say that maybe if you have two women that are raising a child, they maybe do better than a mother and a father raising a child. That may be, but also that might be more of a statistical anomaly than would be like a norm, right? And so when we talk about like legislation or putting things in place, we always legislate for generalities, not for exceptions, right? And so no one's going to say that maybe that can't be effective, but we just don't know. And by not knowing, are we putting people at risk? Are we putting children at risk? Are we turning people into guinea pigs now by kind of gathering data when we know for sure that a mother and a father in a household do have significant effects on the development of a child? I think that's up for debate. But I think the church would say that, yeah, obviously that a mother and father would be good for not only child development, but also a witness of a relationship between two people that's directed towards God is healthy as well, right? And shows people how to live with each other, even when we get on each other's nerves. I mean, anyone growing up in a family will probably tell you that, even especially bigger families, that it's hard to live in a family, right? But you learn how to overcome those things in a family too, and not only do it in healthily, but lovingly, right? That I can still love this person and not like them, right? I think we all have experience in our families, even with our spouses. I hear this all the time. I love every person in my family. I love every person in my parish. I'll go even farther than that. I don't like them all the time. So I think that's fair. But also, too, I think it shows the difference between people, but difference between men and women of how to do that from a male and a female perspective that has good development for both sexes in rearing of children. So that all to be said is that we see that in kind of the roots of Genesis, that you know, it's often thought, well, was that always the plan, that sexual interaction would bring about procreation? Was that always part of God's plan? Because we didn't really see it until after the fall. Well, I think that's the case because otherwise we wouldn't be given bodies to do that, right? There's a question about how angels are created. We don't know. Who knows? We'll see that when we're in heaven. But we aren't pure spiritual beings. We are also body and spirit, right? So we're incarnated souls, just as Jesus is an incarnated soul. And so we're called to then express our sexuality through a bodily way, which just makes sense, right? And it seems like God had that plan from the very beginning. Now, it seems that the fall made that act of love, instead of an act of love, an act of lust, which is why original sin, as St. Augustine thought, was promulgated through the sexual act because it was an act of lust instead of love. Now, the church has kind of developed that in some ways and said, well, yeah, no, the original sin doesn't come from the act of sex itself. It comes from the fact our parents fell. And that's something inherent to each one of us because of our first parents. So we don't want to say that sex is bad and brings about our original sin. But we can say that even within a bond of marriage, sexual action should be an action of love, right? Not just an act of pure lust. It's for the good of each other. And it's pleasurable as a means to the end, right? So we tend to forget that too, that the sex, because it's pleasurable, we think that's the only end. But it's pleasurable because we want people to do it. If sex were not pleasurable, people wouldn't do it. And so even if the good of a child would come about, maybe you could say it's self-sacrificial or whatever else, but God would not want to make it hard to engage with a spouse to have a child. And so it's pleasurable as a means to that end. But even if children will come about in that action, it's still a bond of unity, right? For a married couple, it's a reaffirmation, a re-expression of the marital vows they took at their wedding, right? And so because of that, it's sacred. It's holy. So that's why doing that outside of that bond would be a denigration, a desecration of that great natural gift that God gives us, right? Because the other aspect of that is that even within a bond of marriage, that marital act needs to potentially lead to procreation, right? So in that respect, there's many different ways of, let's say, like foreplay or gratification it can be done as a sexual act that would not necessarily be holy, right? Where it would end in no way of a new being created. That's not to say that every action needs to create a new being, but there needs to be the potential for that action to happen. And so if you have two men or two women, that just can't happen. And if you have a heterosexual couple that are doing things not with that potential, that also is wrong. That's sinful. It's wrong because it's also desecrating that action to what its purpose is. So it's important to recognize that about sex. So when we talk about people who experience same-sex attraction, those who are gender dysphoria to the point where they mutilate themselves, that is a desecration of that great gift. It's not directing our sexuality, that gift inherent to us, towards that particular end of unification and procreation. And so that's also why marriage would be between a man and a woman, because the goods of marriage have to be there. Even the potential of it has to be there. Even if you have a couple that is not fertile, right? Well, there's still a unification involved there. And even a potential for that to happen, right? It won't happen if you don't do it naturally. But if you try to do it naturally and things aren't happening, well, that can be a cross to bear for many couples, for sure. And there are treatments out there that can be within church teaching and helpful to maybe help that come about. But even so, there's still a procreative aspect that enlivens the spirit, right? To witness a married couple that's living their faith joyfully and well and in line with what God wants for them, there's an enlivening of the soul, procreation of the soul, that people are rejuvenated in that, right? Where you wouldn't necessarily see that for people of the same sex who are engaged in those ways. The other thing to understand too about the church is that about marriage is it's a symbol of Christ and his church, right? So when you witness a married couple, what you're seeing is a living representation of Jesus as the bridegroom and his bride, the church. The woman representing the church and the man representing Jesus. It's the same action we see actually at every Mass, that the priest in the person of Jesus, a male, is receiving his bride, the church, at the sacrifice of the cross, right? And so they're all interrelated. And once you start kind of messing with those things, you start kind of destroying it, right? So you can, when you start saying like, well, why can't we have women ordination? Well, that's because that symbol isn't there. That end of that is not present there. That's not fruitful, right? That's not enlivening within someone's soul. And so that's why the matter of a valid sacrament of marriage needs to be a male body and a female body, because otherwise those ends don't come about, right? It's kind of simple. It's simplistic to think about. But people may argue on that. It's like, why can't 2 men or 2 women have just as fulfilling a relationship? Well, here's the thing about that. They may. There may be a very good spiritual, even a very good intellectual, a very good emotional connection between 2 men and 2 women. And we all need that same-sex actual relationship. Even celibates need that. I need good male friends. I need good female friends. But that's different than a sacrament meant towards a particular end. And so even in my physical stature, I'm still called to express my sexuality even as a celibate man, but not in the same way as a married couple would. Because one thing that we're all called to is chastity. So chastity, I think, has got lost in the shuffle quite a bit, right? So what chastity means is really just self-control, right? That I'm called to control my desires, even as a male, and even towards the opposite sex, and even for that desire to maybe be a natural father, because I do have that desire, right? We all have that desire, or to be a natural mother, right? Even a consecrated nun would have that desire. But I've been called to direct that in a way that's deeper and more spiritual than in the physical bond of marriage with another woman, because of the vocation God has called me to be. And that's the point. We're all called to a vocation, and we're all called to that same chastity. So for a married couple, that chastity is different than it would be for me as a celibate man. That chastity is directed towards a particular individual in the bond of marriage. And not just any individual, but a particular individual. This person I've been called to spend the rest of my life with. I am called to engage with this person only, and only this person, in that bond of love, because I've been called by God to do that and share this life for the good of that other person and as a gift to me from her or him, right? For single people, it's the same, kind of the same way. We're called to actually express our sexuality in ways that go beyond just the physical, right? That I, as a man, have a different psychology, have a different persona, have a different way of approaching things than a woman would. That's complementarity that I still need. I still need women in my life as a celibate man, as a single man, to help me with that, as any single person would. But we're called to give ourselves in that way that's different than that bond of marriage, right? And maybe for most people, it may be a temporary state until they find that particular person they're called to be chaste with. For the priests and for consecrated individuals and sisters, we are called to a different way of life. And that's okay. That's okay. That's good. I think it's interesting that the first time I put the collar on, I went to a Deerberg's next to the seminary to get some food. And I was at the checkout line, and the checkout girl, who could have been more than 18, 19 years old, she saw me on the couch. Oh, are you a priest? I said, oh, no, I'm a seminarian. I'm trying to become a priest. And the next words out of her mouth was, oh, that means you can't have sex. Now here, what I answered, and I thought this was quick-witted, but maybe it wasn't. So I said, well, it's not that I can't. So it's that I choose not to, because I've been called to something higher, right, than just the physical. And I think that's a problem. We start reducing ourselves just to our physicality, just to our sexuality. we are closing ourselves off from a whole range of identity and who we are in the eyes of God. We are not just our genitals and what we do with our genitals. We are more than that. We are sons and daughters of the Most High God. And if that's not our true identity, then we are just lost, right? We need to keep that in mind too. That is our identity. If we are baptized people, we are God's sons and daughters. And that's all we really need to know, right? And even though I may struggle with my sexuality, even though I may struggle with my chastity, even though I may struggle with incontinence or continence, and we'll take that in a second, I can still be redeemed. I can still receive salvation because I can turn back to God and receive that grace from Him through my sorrow in not being able to hit that ideal, right? Trusting that God's going to forgive me and give me that grace that I can be with Him one day and experience that fully, even in my sexuality. You know, John Paul II was asked one time, do you think there's sex in heaven? And he said, I hope so. You know, I mean, that's so beautiful. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, why wouldn't there be? Sex is a great thing. It's a beautiful thing. It's a way to express our interaction with the creation, express who we are as individuals. But that comes to our relationship with who we are through God. That I'm a child of God, and because of that, because I'm baptized, I now have this mission towards this other person to get them to heaven. And I express that through my body. I express that through my mind. I express that through my heart and my soul. Just the way Jesus did for each and every one of us. There's a wonderful beauty in that. And that's why marriage is amazing. And God, I love marriage. Marriage is awesome. I won't say otherwise. And it's interesting, I think, when people start talking about these things when it comes to the celibate priesthood or the male priesthood, there's a lack of understanding that, well, no, there's a good in this. There's a benefit in this, not just for the individual, but for the church at large. I'm called to live a celibate life, and praise God for that. Not just because I shouldn't procreate. Maybe that's the case, but it's because I see a benefit in that, and I see a benefit in two people that are dedicating their life to each other to bring about children in this world. And they're different, but they're directed towards that same end, and that's the beauty of it, right? So, and I understand that too, because I think also from a perspective of a married person, they can say there's such a great, wonderful benefit in sex. And here, get me wrong. I know there's a good in sex. I know there's joy in sex. I am chagrined that I can't offer my virginity to my priesthood. I can't. But also too, I appreciate those that can. And I know that even in this life of celibacy, there's a great joy and beauty in it, right? And that's good. That's wonderful. That I can give myself freely to the people that need me. And that's why celibacy is a thing. But also understand that, yeah, there's a great joy in sharing your body, sharing yourself with another person. Yeah, good. And that's what you've been called to. And I'm happy for you for that. And as you should be happy for me being called to this life too, right? So I think that's kind of a synopsis of something of what we talk about, the sexual actions and like what it's directed to, right? But I think it's also important to recognize that no matter what, whether someone experiences same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria, they are also made in the image and likeness of God, just like Adam and Eve, just like each and every one of us. And because of that, there's inherent dignity. And so we need to treat each other with respect and dignity in that respect, because we're called to do that and recognize the presence of God in each individual. But just like any sin, that doesn't mean we condone it, right? I don't condone the sin I do. I confess it, and I try to grow in it, right? And so if I see two people who are engaged in the same-sex relationship, or someone who's struggling with gender dysphoria and wanting to mutilate themselves, I can say that's not a good idea. And I can give reasons, because, well, you're not really giving your life to someone in a way that's beneficial for you or them. You're not appreciating the gift of your sexuality. Now, I can't force anyone to do that either, but I can still love them in the midst of it and want the best for them, even in the midst of that. But I can't condone an action that is against what God's plan is for us, right? And so that's not being judgmental. That's actually willing the good for the other. That's a supreme act of love because it's truthful and it's charitable. And that doesn't mean I can't have compassion. So, I mean, or counsel someone who experiences these things and be loving and pastoral toward them. I hope I am. And even understanding. But my role in those moments is not to say, yeah, do whatever you want, love and do what you want, right? Because the question is raised, what love? Which love are we talking about? I think the love is agape, is a sacrificial love, a love for the other that I want to do everything I can for your good. And we're all called to do that, which means I have to give you the truth. I have to tell you that what you're doing is maybe not beneficial for you. Because not only it's fruitless, but it's also a desecration of that action because the purpose is being desecrated. And again, that's not being judgy. That's just saying objectively that's what's happening here. And that doesn't mean we can't have overwhelming feelings or deal with our psyche that kind of tells us that this is the case. Yeah, I think that'd be very difficult. I would imagine that'd be very hard to live a life of chastity when I feel this urge, but I'm called to something different. Trust me, I know. I get it. But yet we're still called to that life and to that end and to that truth. And in the same respect, I think it's also important too to recognize that there's a big difference between someone who lives their life in the way they want without remorse and someone who's striving to overcome, these desires and failing. I think there is. That's why we have the sacrament of reconciliation. That's why we have these gifts of grace that are given to us by God so that we can grow and heal and try, right? So all that to be said is that, this is not meant to be hateful, obviously. But also I think it's called to shine a light on what the church teaches about these things and hopefully go out and be the face of Christ to others and help them see these truths. It's hard, especially when you live in a society that tells us otherwise, right? That, no, hey, do whatever you want. Okay, well, I know in my own experience, whenever I do what I want, that usually leads to problems. Big problems, right? And so I imagine a lot of people experience that same thing too. And again, I'm not saying those that experience same-sex attraction or just gender dysphoria are wrong or evil or anything else. But I wonder how much more joyful, happy, fulfilling their life would be if they can strive to live in that chastity which we're all called. To strive to live in that gift of sexuality that God has given us and recognize that as a gift. And not just limit ourselves and diminish ourselves to what we do with our genitals. I imagine this world would be much better, more joyful, more fulfilling, and also a lot more harmony. But even for the individuals that experience these things, freeing. I know it is for me whenever I kind of follow these things that God wants for me. But I guess that's each individual to determine. So in light of that, one thing that we have some documents is, I think it's interesting that in 1968, after the council, Paul VI wrote a document called Humanae Vitae. Now at the time, it was kind of panned. It was sort of like, well, we don't know how this really works in the magisterium. Is it really, what level of assent needs to be given? I think over time, though, and in the writing, it's pretty evident that this was meant to be dogmatic. But what's interesting about Paul VI is that he was kind of looking at the times in the midst of sexual revolution, in the midst of other revolution, and kind of a prophetic response, calling people back to this chastity, this understanding of what the church teaches. So I'll preface it by saying that it started really in 1930 with the Lambeth Council of the Anglican Communion. So in that council, Anglicans, for the first time, detracted from the traditional teaching when it comes to sexual ethics. And they detracted somewhat when it came to the understanding of contraception. Now, there's been a lot of talk about after the overturning Roe v. Wade that maybe contraception is going to be overturned and everything else. Maybe, hopefully, maybe I don't know. But what the Lambeth Council, these groups of Anglicans said was that it is licit to use contraceptive methods within the bond of marriage, provided it's already been evident that the two have been open to life. So in other words, I think what they were envisioning was, we had these new developments of this thing called the pill and these things, called condoms. Condoms have been around for a while, but these forms of contraception, the question was kind of like, well, what can be done? What can we use these things, right? And what they kind of concluded was, well, it seems reasonable to say that for people already married, again, already married, a man and a woman, that have already had children. Maybe they're getting a little long in years, maybe they're getting elderly or sick, and they want to have any more children because they're in their old age. So maybe in that respect, it would be licit to use contraception to not become pregnant. So what's fascinating is then for the next, then World War II happened, other things, and then when Vatican II came around, this question was kind of picked up by the Catholic Church, and there was a kind of a study done, a committee put together by the Pope going into Vatican II. This was John the 23rd, to look at this question. And so after Vatican II concluded, they kind of came back and said, yeah, I think we agree with the Anglicans. It seems reasonable to say that these things, because they're products of modern man and products of human intellect, that they could be illicitly used in the bond of marriage. Well, Paul VI, who was the Pope at that time when this commission gave up this information, this was made of doctors and bishops and theologians, everyone. He wrote Humanae Vitae, and basically what he said was, yeah, that doesn't seem right. And he actually went into very specifics about things like the pill, because he would say, well, the pill, from his understanding, works in kind of three ways. It can stop the ovum and the sperm from meeting, which, okay, maybe that's illicit, that's fine. But the other way it actually works is through an abortifacient. So in other words, after the sperm meets the egg, it can cause it not to actually attach to the uterine wall. Well, that's a problem, because once that sperm and egg come together, what the church has taught infallibly now for centuries is that now becomes a human person. And so it would be illicit then to abort that child, provided there's no medical issue with the mother, right? But the problem with the pill is you don't know which one it does, right? So you don't know how it does that in your own body. Thing about condoms, well, condoms kind of take up that other aspect of the sexual gift, is that they don't provide that unification of the two, right? There's a barrier. The fact that it's artificial doesn't really matter, but you create a barrier between that self-gift of the man and the woman. And so that doesn't really seem licit. But then he said, if these were allowed, here's probably the consequences of that. You'll see a rise in infidelity. You'll see a rise in pornography. You'll see a rise in abortion. You'll see a rise in these other aspects of sexuality that are become very muddled and unclear. How prophetic that in 1968 he was saying these things. And we look ahead now, almost 50 years later, and we've seen that happen, right? Going back one thing to Irvin, so it is often brought up sometimes in conversation that certain theologians have not been clear about when the soul enters the body, and that is true. People like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas were kind of saying that, yeah, there's kind of an open question on that. That I think Augustine thought it took 3 months before the soul enters the body because of the way the sperm works. Even St. Thomas Aquinas posited that it may take 8 days for the ovum to be fertilized. But they both would say that the real kind of evidence of a soul is movement, right? Growth. Now, what they didn't have also is the advantage of scientific technology. So they didn't necessarily see how atoms started splitting, cells started splitting once that happened. And because of that movement, they would even say today that, oh yes, well, that would be evidence of a soul. But they would also go as far as say, even if we don't know when the soul enters the body, it still would be morally wrong to stop that process from happening, right? So even if it took 8 days for that sperm to reach the ovum, it'd be morally wrong to try to stop that process because of the potentiality of life to happen, right? So we wanted to always, because I hear some politicians, even Catholic politicians, use that argument, and that's a bad argument because that's not only is it not accurate in context of what they were trying to say, because what they were really trying to get at was the purpose of marriage, right? They weren't trying to answer that question of when the soul meets the body. They were really trying to answer the question of what the purpose of marriage is and how procreation works. But even today, I think that they would say with the information we have that, oh yes, of course, the soul enters the body right then, because we see that, right? We can show that once the sperm gets in there, cells start dividing, there's movement, there's growth, and that's evidence of a soul. Just wanted to put that out there because that can be somewhat confusing too. But all this to say is that, again, we look at the sexuality as this great gift from God, and that we should use it for what it's directed towards, which is not only bringing about new life, a unification of two beings, two people, but also directed towards that final end that's found in God, right? And so whatever life we're called to live, we're meant to do that. And I think it's also important maybe to read Humanae Vitae. It's not a very long read. Actually, it's very interesting, I thought. And I think it was also interesting that it was kind of diminished quite a time when it came out. I think John Paul II did a great justice by making this the basis of his theology of the body. He would have these audiences on Wednesday, and for 4 years, he would just give this kind of catechesis on sexuality that's based on Genesis. And he would use a lot of Humanae Vitae as sort of a basis for what he was saying. So again, I would advise reading it. It's a great read. Got a copy here if anyone wants it. And if you have a lot of time and have a lot of philosophy, read Theology of the Body. It's a longer read and there's a lot of philosophical terms, but it's also very beautiful. Maybe you could take some time to digest it over the course of a couple of years. And it might be good to do too. But it kind of answers a lot of questions when it comes to human sexuality and human anthropology in the Catholic sense. So yeah, thanks everyone for listening. If there are any questions, I'm open to that.
I'm good.
Okay, great. All right, everybody. Have a good week. We'll see you.